The great hall of Casterly Rock was adorned with golden banners, the sigil of House Lannister gleaming in the firelight. The air was thick with the scent of wine, roasted meats, and the quiet murmur of lords discussing the unexpected union before them. Eddard Stark, Lord of Winterfell, stood at the center of it all, his expression unreadable, though those who knew him well would recognize the discomfort in his stiff posture. Across from him, dressed in resplendent crimson and gold, was Cersei Lannister, the daughter of Tywin Lannister, the Lion of the West. She did not smile. This was not the life she had wanted. She had dreamed of marrying Prince Rhaegar Targaryen, of being the queen she always believed she was meant to be. But those dreams had died when the rebellion swept across the realm like wildfire, leaving the Targaryens shattered and House Baratheon victorious. Tywin, ever the strategist, had acted swiftly, withdrawing his forces from the battlefield only to return with a new offer, his daughter's hand in marriage to the man who would one day inherit the North. Robert Baratheon had taken the Iron Throne, and instead of wedding Cersei, he had chosen Lyanna Stark, whose disappearance had started the war. So now, here they were, Eddard Stark, the cold and dutiful Warden of the North, and Cersei Lannister, the proud and ambitious lioness, bound by politics, not love. Tywin had insisted on the match, seeing it as a means to bind the North and the West in an unbreakable alliance. Lord Rickard Stark had once sought a southern marriage for his eldest son, and had he lived, he might have accepted such a union even without rebellion. The Septon spoke the ancient vows, his voice steady over the crackling torches. "With this kiss, I pledge my love." Ned barely hesitated before leaning in. He did not close his eyes. He saw the steel in Cersei's gaze, the way her lips barely parted to meet his. When their lips touched, it was nothing more than an obligation fulfilled. The hall erupted in applause, but Cersei did not look at her new husband. Instead, her green eyes flickered toward Jaime, her twin, standing near their father. For the first time in her life she felt trapped, but she was no fool. If she could not have Rhaegar, if she could not have a crown, then she would make certain she still held power in this marriage. As the night wore on and the feast began, Ned found himself seated beside his new wife, across from Robert Baratheon and Lyanna Stark. The tension between them was palpable. Robert, drunk on victory and ale, was laughing boisterously with Stannis, and Jon Arryn, but his glances at Lyanna were possessive, as if he still feared she would vanish like smoke. Lyanna, however, was withdrawn, her fingers tracing patterns on the rim of her goblet. Ned turned back to his own troubles. Cersei sipped, her wine slowly, her expression carefully schooled. He did not know her. He had heard whispers, of course, how she was beautiful but cruel, how she was ambitious beyond reason. She had been raised in a world of power plays and ruthlessness, a world where love was secondary to legacy. She was not like Catelyn, who had been kind despite their arranged match. Cersei was different. That night, as he entered the chamber prepared for them, Ned braced himself. He had done his duty before. He would do it again. Cersei stood by the fire, still in her wedding gown, her golden hair cascading down her back. "This isn't what I wanted," she said suddenly, her voice quiet but firm. Ned sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Nor I. But it is done." She turned to face him, her green eyes burning. "Do you love her?" It took him a moment to realize she meant Lyanna. "I love my sister," he said carefully. "Not as Robert does, but as a brother should." She studied him for a long time, then let out a short, bitter laugh. "At least you are honest," she muttered, stepping away. "My father expects me to give you sons." Ned straightened, his jaw tightening. "And I expect you to be faithful." She smirked, tilting her head. "Do you?" There was something dangerous, in her tone, something that told him this was no timid southern girl. She was testing him. "I will not dishonor you," he said, "and I will not tolerate dishonor in return." For a moment, he thought she might spit some cruel remark, but then she simply turned away, reaching for the laces of her gown. "We should get this over with, then," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. Ned clenched his fists. This was his life now, a marriage of ice and gold. The morning after their wedding, Ned Stark rose early, as was his custom. The air in Casterly Rock felt stifling, too warm compared to the crisp cold of Winterfell. He glanced at the woman still lying beside him, her golden hair spilling over the pillows. Cersei Lannister was the picture of beauty, but her face, even in sleep, seemed troubled. He did not linger. Dressing quickly, he stepped out into the corridors, where Lannister guards lined the halls like golden statues. He hated this place. Already, Tywin Lannister was waiting for him in the Solar as if expecting his arrival. The Warden of the West regarded his new son-in-law with his usual unreadable stare, his fingers steepled together. "You are up early, Lord Stark," Tywin said, his voice even. "A northern habit, I assume." "A habit of responsibility," Ned corrected. He did not like this man, nor did he trust him. Tywin gave a small, amused smile, but it did not reach his eyes. "Good. Responsibility will serve you well, now that you are bound to my daughter. I assume the marriage was consummated?" Ned's jaw tightened. He did not like discussing such things, especially not with Cersei's father. "It is not your concern, Lord Tywin." Tywin merely nodded, as if he had expected that response. "You misunderstand me, Lord Stark. It is very much my concern. I do not arrange matches lightly. I expect this union to produce heirs, and strong ones at that." A muscle in Ned's jaw twitched. "I do not need reminding of my duties." Tywin stood, stepping toward him. "See that you don't." Ned turned on his heel and left before he said something he would regret. Cersei spent the morning in the gardens, though she found no joy in them. Her ladies-in-waiting surrounded her, giggling over talk of marriage and what it meant to be a wife, but Cersei paid them little mind. She had spent her entire life preparing to be a queen, not the wife of a northern lord. She felt trapped. Jaime had barely spoken to her since the wedding. She knew he was angry, but what choice had she been given? Their father had decreed it, and Tywin's word was law. When her ladies finally dispersed, she sat alone beneath the shade of a towering tree, gripping the stem of her goblet so tightly she feared it might break. She had been raised to believe that women wielded power through marriage, through their husbands. But what power did she have now? She glanced toward the castle, where she knew Ned was likely brooding over honor and duty. He was not a man she could mold or manipulate. He was too rigid, too stubborn, but he was hers now. If she could not rule through love, she would rule through necessity. Ned Stark would learn that a lioness was not so easily caged. The weeks that followed were cold despite the southern warmth. Ned and Cersei settled into an uneasy existence, bound by duty but little else. She was the Lady of Winterfell now, though it was clear that the North would never see her as one of their own. The northern lords regarded her with wary eyes, and she, in turn, viewed them as beneath her. When she was not fulfilling her obligations as Ned's wife, she spent her time in the Solar, surrounded by Lannister retainers who had accompanied her north. She laughed with them, whispered with them, while the rest of Winterfell remained distant. It did not take long for Ned to hear the rumors. "She speaks with her brother too often," Rose Bolton murmured one evening, as they sat in council. "Some say she prefers his company to yours, my lord." Ned's grip tightened on the armrest of his chair. "I do not listen to rumors, Lord Bolton." "Perhaps you should," Bolton replied smoothly. "The North is not kind to Lannisters, and some believe you have brought a viper into your den." Ned said nothing, but the words lingered. That night, He found Cersei alone in their chambers, pouring herself wine. "You are spending a great deal of time with Jaime," he said, his voice even. Cersei did not look up. "He is my brother. He is a Kingsguard. His place is in the capital, not lingering in Winterfell." She smirked. "Do you plan to send him away, husband, or do you fear what people might say?" Ned took a step closer, lowering his voice. "I fear nothing, but I will not have whispers of impropriety staining this house." Cersei's smile faded. "You will not control me as my father did." "I have no wish to control you," he said, "only to protect my house." She studied him for a long moment, then took a slow sip of her wine. "You are not like Robert," she murmured. Ned frowned. "I take that as a compliment." Her lips curled, but there was something unreadable in her gaze. "You shouldn't." She turned away, leaving him to wonder whether she was a woman broken by her own ambitions or one who still had schemes left to play. Either way, he knew one thing for certain. His marriage was a battlefield. The years passed in an uneasy truce. Cersei Lannister was now the Lady of Winterfell, but she never truly belonged. The North did not welcome outsiders easily, and they had no love for Lannisters. She ruled from Winterfell's halls with quiet resentment, her golden hair a stark contrast to the dark stone and snow-covered landscape. She had given Eddard Stark 3 children. Their firstborn, Torren Stark, was a boy with his mother's golden hair and his father's solemn grey eyes. Even as a child, he carried the weight of both his lineages, the heir to Winterfell who would one day inherit the North. Their second child, a daughter named Sansa, had Cersei's beauty but a sharpness that was neither fully Northern nor fully Lannister. She learned quickly that words were weapons, though her father tried to temper her with honor. And their youngest, Jon, was the true blend of ice and fire, a boy with dark curls and green eyes, a rare combination of Stark and Lannister blood. Cersei had done her duty as a wife, but she had never let herself love Ned. And he, in turn, had never let himself trust her. Winterfell was colder than usual that year, the winds howling against its ancient walls. Cersei sat in the great hall, watching as her husband trained their eldest son in the courtyard. Torren, barely 6, struggled to lift the wooden sword, his arms shaking under the weight. Ned, ever the patient teacher, corrected his stance, offering words of encouragement. Cersei scoffed. "A boy does not need kindness to learn how to fight," she murmured. "He needs discipline." Septa Mordain, who had been attending to young Sansa, looked uncomfortable. "Lord Stark believes in guiding his children with—" "Spare me the lecture," Cersei snapped, waving her away. "I have heard enough of northern wisdom." In truth, she knew Torren would grow strong, but she feared his northern blood would make him weak. She had seen too much honor, too much loyalty, and she knew it was those very things that got men killed. She would make certain her son understood that the world did not reward good men. That night, as she sat beside Ned in their chambers, she broached the subject. "Torren is not ready to rule," she said. Ned glanced up from the maps he had been studying. "He is a child." "Exactly," she said, standing. "A child who does not yet understand the power he will wield. He needs guidance." "And he will have it," Ned said, voice firm. "From me." Cersei sighed, crossing the room. "And what if he does not inherit your honor, Ned? What if he needs more than just your principles to survive?" Ned looked up at her, his grey eyes unreadable. "Then I will teach him to be better than those who only seek power for its own sake." Cersei's lips pressed into a thin line. She knew what he meant. She knew he was talking about her. Jaime Lannister had remained in the North far longer than he should have. Cersei knew it, Ned knew it, and so did everyone else. The Kingslayer was no fool, and though he pretended to be at ease, there was something restless in him. He trained with the northern men, drank with the lords, and spent too much time watching over Cersei's children. One evening, as Jaime walked through the corridors of Winterfell, he found Torren in the Godswood, gripping a practice sword. "You're holding it wrong," Jaime said, leaning against a nearby tree. The boy spun, startled. "Ser Jaime," he greeted, lowering his sword. Jaime smirked. "A true swordsman never lowers his guard." Torren frowned, lifting the sword again. "Father says a good warrior fights with honor." Jaime let out a short laugh. "Did he now?" He stepped closer, nodding toward the blade. "Tell me, nephew, do you think the world rewards honor?" Torren hesitated. Jaime continued, his tone light but knowing. "The realm praises my brother, your uncle Tyrion, for his mind. They praise your father for his honor, and yet who truly holds power?" The boy swallowed. "Grandfather does." Jaime nodded approvingly. "Exactly." Torren's young mind struggled with the thought. He wanted to be strong like his father, but he was beginning to see that the world was more complicated than just right and wrong. From a distance, Cersei watched, her heart swelling with pride. Her brother was teaching her son something that Eddard never could, the game of power. The next day, Ned found his son training alone, his grip firmer, his stance more precise. "Who taught you that?" Ned asked, watching him move. Torren hesitated. "Uncle Jaime." A shadow passed over Ned's face. He knelt before the boy, gripping his shoulder. "Your uncle is a great warrior, but remember this." He met his son's golden-green eyes. "You are a Stark, and Starks do not play games with honor." Torren did not understand yet, but he would. As Ned stood, his gaze flickered toward the tower where Cersei watched from above. There would be war in this house, even if no swords were drawn. A battle for their son's soul. And Ned Stark did not intend to lose. The North had long been known for its loyalty. The Starks ruled as kings in the North for thousands of years before bending the knee to the Targaryens. Even now, under the rule of King Robert Baratheon, the North remained a place where honor still meant something. But the marriage between Eddard Stark and Cersei Lannister had fractured that foundation. Whispers moved through the halls of Winterfell like a cold wind. The northern lords, ever watchful, saw Cersei's influence on the Stark children, especially on Torren. They saw the way Jaime lingered in Winterfell, when his place should have been in King's Landing. They saw how Cersei spent more time in the Solar, surrounded by Lannister men, than with her husband. And then there were the rumors that Jaime Lannister had too much interest in the children, rumors that Cersei plotted to bring more of her father's forces into the North, rumors that Winterfell was not as loyal to the crown as it once was. Ned Stark heard them all. He ignored most of them, as he always had, choosing to focus on what he could see with his own eyes. But what he saw worried him. Torren, once a quiet and observant boy, was growing into someone harder, colder. He questioned things more. He asked why they should listen to Robert Baratheon. He asked why the North should bow to anyone. And when Ned asked him who had put those thoughts in his head, the answer was always the same. Mother says a true king should not need to kneel. Ned's blood ran cold. The day things changed forever was the day a raven arrived from King's Landing. Jon Arryn was dead. Ned sat in the great hall of Winterfell, the letter heavy in his hands. Robert was coming north, bringing his queen, his court, and an offer. He already knew what it would be. "Hand of the king," he murmured, rubbing a hand over his face. Across from him, Cersei sat with a cup of wine, unreadable. "An honor," she said, though her tone lacked any warmth. "One you should accept." Ned looked up sharply. "You think I should go to King's Landing?" Cersei leaned back, swirling her wine. "It would be unwise to refuse. Robert does not take rejection well." Ned studied her. She had never cared for Robert. She had despised him ever since he had chosen Lyanna over her. And yet she wanted him to go. That was enough to make him suspicious. "What are you plotting, Cersei?" he asked bluntly. She smiled, but there was no kindness in it. "I plot nothing, husband. I only see the truth. If you refuse the king, he will question your loyalty. If you leave, Winterfell is still in safe hands." "Your hands, you mean?" She did not deny it. Ned exhaled slowly. He did not trust her, but she was not wrong. If he rejected Robert's offer, it could be seen as an insult. Worse, it could put the North in danger. But if he left, he would be leaving his children, his son, under Cersei's influence. It was a choice he did not want to make. The banners of House Baratheon and House Lannister filled the courtyard as the royal procession arrived. Robert Baratheon, older and heavier than the last time Ned had seen him, greeted him with a bone-crushing embrace. "You've gotten old, Stark." He laughed, clapping Ned on the back. Ned smirked. "And you've gotten fat." Robert roared with laughter, but Cersei, standing beside him, barely concealed her disdain. The Queen's eyes swept over the Stark children, lingering on Torren. She nodded approvingly, as if seeing something she liked. Ned did not like that at all. Over the next few days, Robert drank, feasted, and eventually asked the question that Ned had been dreading. "Be my hand, Ned. Jon Arryn is dead. I need someone I can trust." The words were simple. The meaning was not. If Ned said no, Robert would be insulted. If Ned said yes, he would be leaving Winterfell in the hands of a woman he did not trust. And then Cersei spoke. "Of course he will go, Your Grace. It is his duty." Ned stiffened. He looked at his wife, and for the first time he saw not just a woman he distrusted. He saw an enemy, but he had no choice. He knelt before Robert and spoke the words that sealed his fate. "As you command, Your Grace." Cersei smiled, and in that moment, Ned knew. He had made a mistake. King's Landing was a different kind of cold. Not the sharp, biting cold of the North, but the cold of deception, of whispered plots and unseen daggers. Eddard Stark, now Hand of the King, had barely set foot in the Red Keep before he felt its weight pressing down on him. Robert was still the same, loud, boisterous, drinking himself into oblivion, but he was not the man Ned had once known. He was slower, heavier, a king in name only, and behind him, always watching, was Cersei. She had not come with him to King's Landing. She had remained in Winterfell, ruling in his absence, but her reach extended beyond the North. Letters arrived from her frequently, filled with charming words, but laced with veiled warnings. "Torren grows strong. The North remembers who it belongs to. You may serve the king, but I rule our home." Ned burned each letter after reading them. His time in the capital was spent navigating a web of politics he despised. Varys with his riddles, Littlefinger with his smirks. The small council filled with men who cared more for gold than for the good of the realm. And then there were the whispers. Jon Arryn had been murdered. The more Ned dug, the more uneasy he became. He spoke with Stannis, with Pycelle, with those who had served the late hand, and a single truth emerged. The royal children were not Roberts. Joffrey, Myrcella, and Tommen, all of them Lannisters, all of them Jaimes. Ned's blood turned to ice. He had suspected something dark, but this was treason of the highest order. If Robert learned the truth, there would be war, and Cersei knew it. Ned had never been a man who played the Game of Thrones, but he knew when he had been placed in the center of it. He could not keep this knowledge to himself. He had to tell Robert. But before he could, a new disaster struck. Robert had gone hunting. He had left in high spirits, laughing, drinking, boasting as always. But when he returned, he was dying. A wild boar had gored him, but Ned suspected otherwise. The wine had been too much, the wound too deep. Cersei had not been here to orchestrate it herself, but her allies, her father, her spies, were more than capable. As Robert lay dying, he called for Ned. You'll be regent," Robert rasped. Until Joffrey is of age. Ned clenched his fists. He could not lie to his friend, even now. Joffrey is not your son, he said quietly. Robert's breath hitched. He opened his mouth, then coughed, blood flecking his lips. What? What did you say? Ned hesitated, then told him everything. The truth of Cersei and Jaime, the lie that had sat upon the Iron Throne. Robert's hands trembled. His eyes darkened with rage. That whore. He tried to rise, but his strength failed him. Kill them, he gasped. Kill them all. And then he was gone. The king of Westeros, the last rebel standing, was dead, and chaos had begun. Ned did what honor demanded. He wrote letters to Stannis Baratheon, the rightful heir. He called upon men he thought he could trust. He took Robert's will and prepared to confront the council. But he had underestimated Cersei Lannister. By the time he made his move, it was already too late. The gold cloaks had been bought. The city watch stood with the Lannisters. Joffrey sat upon the throne before Robert's body had even gone cold. And when Ned Stark entered the throne room, he knew he had lost. Cersei was not in the capital, but her will was felt in every corner. Littlefinger betrayed him. His men were slaughtered, and in the end, Eddard Stark, Warden of the North, was dragged before Joffrey Baratheon. Joffrey grinned down at him, his mother's cruelty shining in his young eyes. "My mother said you would be a problem," Joffrey said, "but I didn't think you'd be this stupid." Ned was forced to his knees, his head pounding. "Stannis is the rightful king," he said. Joffrey scoffed. "No, I am the king." He turned to the crowd. "And traitors do not get to live," Sansa screamed from the sidelines. Arya was nowhere to be seen, and Ned knew in that moment that he had made a fatal mistake. Cersei had won. He thought of Winterfell, of his son Torren, who was growing into something colder than any Stark before him. He thought of Jon, of Sansa, of Robb, who would hear of this and march to war. And as the executioner raised his sword, Eddard Stark's last thought was not of honor. It was of Cersei. She had played him from the beginning, and now his family would pay the price. Winterfell was colder than usual. Cersei stood by the window of the great hall, staring at the vast expanse of white beyond the walls. Snow had begun to fall, light but steady, dusting the towers and ramparts in soft white. It reminded her that this was not her home. Her home was golden and warm, full of power and riches. Casterly Rock, King's Landing, the places where real rulers made their mark. Winterfell was a prison, but not for much longer. The Raven had arrived that morning. Ned Stark was dead, executed as a traitor. Her husband, the man who had bound her to this frozen wasteland, had been brought low before the entire realm. She allowed herself a small smile. He had always underestimated her. The North was mourning, the castle was quiet in its grief, but Cersei felt none of it. She had been playing the game far longer than Ned ever had, and she had won. But her victory was not without risk. Robb Stark had called his banners. The North was rising, and she was standing at the very heart of the storm. Torren had not spoken since they received the news. He had sat in silence, his hands clenched at his sides, his golden hair hanging over his face. He had been raised to be strong, to rule with both wisdom and ruthlessness. But he was still only a boy. His father was dead, his uncle Robb was marching to war, and his mother, she did not weep, she did not rage. She simply drank her wine and told him, "Your father was a fool. He let his honor blind him, and it got him killed." Torren had stared at her, his grey eyes, his stark eyes, dark with something dangerous. "Do you not care at all?" he asked. Cersei sighed, setting her goblet down. "Care?" She leaned forward, her voice smooth and cold. I care that you do not make the same mistake. The world does not reward honor, Torren. It rewards strength. If you want to survive, you must learn that lesson now." Torren's hands trembled. For the first time, he saw his mother not as the gentle woman who had whispered to him at night, but as something else, something ruthless, something dangerous. Cersei had overplayed her hand. She had assumed that her position in Winterfell would protect her, that the North would grieve but accept what had happened, that Robb would ride south and she would remain untouched in Winterfell. She had miscalculated. The North was not like the South, and the people of Winterfell, the bannermen, the soldiers, the lords, they did not forget. She felt their eyes on her as she walked the halls, the way the servants spoke in hushed whispers, the way the guards hesitated before answering her summons. She still held power, but it was slipping, and when the first raven arrived from Robb's camp, she knew it was only a matter of time. Robb had declared war, and he wanted her gone. The castle erupted in chaos on a cold autumn night. The gates were thrown open. Men loyal to House Stark flooded the halls. Cersei barely had time to react before the sounds of swords clashing filled the corridors. She grabbed Torren's hand, pulling him through the halls, her heart pounding. She had always known this day would come, but she had not expected it so soon. "Stay close to me," she ordered. Torren did not speak. His face was unreadable. They reached the stables, where her Lannister guards were waiting, ready to escort her south. But just as she reached for her horse, she heard the voice. "You're not going anywhere." Torren turned first. His mother's grip tightened around his wrist. Rose Bolton stood in the doorway, his pale eyes calm and unreadable. Behind him, men in stark colors blocked the exit. Cersei straightened, her chin lifting. "You would betray your own allies?" Rose tilted his head. "The North does not bow to lions." Cersei's fingers curled into fists. "I am the Lady of Winterfell." Roos's lips barely twitched. "Not anymore." She reached for Torren, but the boy stepped back. His grey eyes met hers. For the first time, she saw the conflict in them. The Lannister blood in his veins, the Stark legacy weighing on his shoulders. And then, quietly, he said, "I will stay." Cersei felt something cold settle in her chest. "Torren," she whispered. He did not move. She realized then that she had lost him. The boy she had shaped, the son she had tried to make in her own image, he had chosen his father's side. Rose stepped forward. "Lady Lannister, you will be escorted to Riverrun, where you will be sent to King's Landing as a prisoner of war." Cersei's nails dug into her palms. She wanted to fight. She wanted to scream. But there was no one left on her side. So for the first time in her life, Cersei Lannister was forced to flee. Winterfell belonged to the Starks once more. Cersei was gone, escorted away under heavy guard, her golden hair hidden beneath the hood of a Stark-cloaked prisoner. The banners of House Lannister had been torn down and burned in the courtyard. The men of the North did not celebrate. There was no victory in a war that had only just begun. Robb Stark had declared himself king in the North. Torren watched from the ramparts as the banners of his house flew high once again. He should have felt relief. He should have felt pride. Instead, he felt nothing. His mother had been stripped of her power, humiliated, and cast out. He had let it happen, and yet he could not shake the feeling that this war was not just about vengeance for his father. It was about power, and power had a way of changing men. When Robb returned to Winterfell, he was not the brother Torren had known. War had changed him. He was harder now, his face lined with the weight of command. The lords of the North swore fealty to him, and for the first time since the days of the ancient kings, the North stood as a kingdom once more. "You did the right thing," Robb told Torren one evening. "You chose the North." Torren hesitated. "I chose my father." Robb smiled grimly. "Then we are both our father's sons." They stood together in the great hall, where once their father had sat in quiet judgment. Now it was Robb's place, and one day it would be Torren's if he survived. The North marched south. Winterfell remained strong, held by Torren and Rose Bolton, while Robb led his army into battle. The Riverlands burned under Lannister. Retribution. The Freys waited at the twins, watching and weighing their options, but Torren had been raised by a Lannister as well as a Stark. He knew what came next, and so he wrote a letter. Cersei had not remained a prisoner for long. By the time her captors reached the Riverlands, Lannister forces intercepted them. The men who had held her were slaughtered, and she was taken to River Run, where she was treated as a guest instead of a prisoner. The moment she was free, she sent a message to her father. Tywin responded with an army. By the time Torren's letter reached her, she was already back in King's Landing. But she read it nonetheless. "Mother, you once told me that power is the only thing that matters, that the world does not reward honor. You were right, but it does not reward weakness either. The North will not kneel. I will not kneel. I am my father's son, but I am yours as well. And I know that this war will not end in peace. I do not ask for forgiveness. I do not ask for love. I ask for your respect. Torren Stark." Cersei stared at the words for a long time. Her son, the boy she had shaped, had turned against her, but not fully, and that meant there was still a chance to mold him into something greater, a chance to win the game. She burned the letter before anyone else could see it, and then she smiled. The war between the Starks and the Lannisters raged across the realm, a storm of blood and vengeance that consumed everything in its path. The North had declared its independence. Robb Stark, the young wolf, led his armies south, winning battle after battle against the Lannisters. But Cersei Lannister had never been one to accept defeat. From her throne in King's Landing, she maneuvered her forces with cold precision, playing the Game of Thrones as only a Lannister could. Her father, Tywin, commanded the armies, ensuring that the Lannisters held their ground despite Robb's victories. But the true battle was not being fought on the fields of war. It was being fought in the heart of Winterfell. Torren had been raised on two different lessons. His father had taught him honor. His mother had taught him power. Now he was forced to choose between them. As Robb continued his war, Torren ruled in his stead at Winterfell. He was young, but he was no fool. He saw the shifting loyalties of the northern lords, the whispers in the halls. The North was strong, but war had a way of turning allies into enemies. And then, one night, a raven arrived. It carried a simple message: "Come to King's Landing. There is a place for you here." There was no name on the letter, but he knew who had sent it: his mother. Torren rode south under the cover of darkness. No one knew of his departure, not the lords of the North, not even Robb. When he arrived in King's Landing, he expected hostility. Instead, he was welcomed as if he were a long-lost prince. Cersei greeted him in the Red Keep, her expression unreadable. "You came," she said. Torren studied her. She was different from the mother he remembered. Her beauty was still striking, but there was something hollow in her eyes, something weary. "I came to hear what you have to say," he replied. Cersei smiled. "You have your father's stubbornness, but you have my mind, and you know that the North cannot stand alone." Torren did not respond. He knew that she was right. If the North fought alone, it would eventually fall. The war could not be won with honor alone. But could he betray his own blood? Could he betray Robb? Cersei stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Your father died because he refused to play the game. Do not make the same mistake." Torren did not betray his brother, but he did not warn him either. When Robb marched to the twins to secure an alliance with House Frey, Torren was in King's Landing. He was not there to see what happened, but he heard of it: the slaughter, The betrayal, the Red Wedding. Robb Stark, the king in the north, was dead. Catelyn Stark was dead. The north was shattered. And suddenly, Torren was the last true heir of Winterfell. His choice had been made for him. Torren returned to Winterfell, not as a conqueror, but as a survivor. The north was broken, its banners torn down, its lords divided. Some had bent the knee to the Lannisters. Others had fled into the shadows, waiting for another leader to rise. And Torren knew that if he did not act, the Starks would be wiped from history. He called his banners, he swore vengeance. But he did not fight for honor, he fought for survival. He fought like a Lannister. And in the end, it was not a Stark who ruled the north. It was something else, something in between. The last son of ice and gold, and the game was far from over. Torren Stark, the son of Ned and Cersei, had outlived them all. His father was dead, his mother consumed by her own ambitions. The north was his. But at what cost? He had not fought for love. He had not fought for vengeance. He had fought because he understood the truth. In the Game of Thrones there were no heroes, only those who survived. And he had survived. For now.